introduce Richard Wagner from George Mason to all of you, to those of you who don't know Dick Wagner. He has what I think looks to be a fascinating paper that will fit in very nicely with some of the discussion we had this morning. Now that I've heard the discussion, I can see the connection even better. Economics, rational action or social science, Marshall versus Edgeworth on the social question. So it's great to have you here, Dick, and please welcome Rich Wagner.
Thank you, Sandy. I'm very glad to be here. David asked if I might give something on the history of thought. I respond that I don't really have the mentality of a historian of thought, that I really have the mentality of a theorist, but I happen to like to read old books because I find that old books often have more genuine thought content than much of what is written these days. And David responded and said, well, liking to read old books these days is surely sufficient. And so I took David at his word, gave me this title, and because it fit something that was on my mind. And then as I was writing the paper, as I got towards the end of the paper, I realized that, well, my title is kind of misleading because it has Marshall versus Edgeworth in the title, which I did because that gives it some kind of history of thought kind of locus, which I felt obligated to David to give. But yet, as I read it through, I said, well, readers don't really get anything about Marshall or Edgeworth from the paper. And so my interest is really in what's, starting from the early 19th century, was called the social question, which in one form or another is this kind of question of how, I might say that some of the natural kinds of quarrels or antagonisms among people might be softened or ameliorated in one fashion or another, moving from potential latent conflict into perhaps expanding the reach of concord as a social question. And that was what my interest was. And I thought of Marshall and Edgeworth because of David's asking if I could present something, because I found in them the basic kind of dichotomy that I wanted to carry forward in examining this question, but it's a dichotomy that's present in many other sources. So when I got to the end of the paper, I said, well, I should do better in making some connection to, perhaps to assuage my conscience or something, to say, well, this really is history of thought. And so I decided to try, I have to get this here. Oops. My mouse has disappeared. Oh, here's the mouse. So I said, well, just as we can talk about L'Espère and Posh quantity indexes and price indexes, I found myself thinking, well, there's a Posh and a L'Espère kind of type of way of doing history of thought. You might say if these are quantity indexes there, to say that in both cases, the question is measuring output from X0 to X1 in the two periods. And the question becomes, in that case, what kind of price basis you use, whether you use the initial period prices or the later period prices. And I thought of that in the same sense that in terms of reading, I titled this section something like on Posh, L'Espère, and reading old texts. And thinking in that way that I could see in my reading two kinds of styles of using old texts. One, what I would refer to as the L'Espère equivalent, is one that takes seriously, as it were, the basing point is the original period, and trying to understand more fully what was going on at that period. To my way of thinking, a wonderful example of that kind of theorizing is actually a book by a sociologist named Randall columns called The Sociology of Philosophies. And what Collins did in that kind of work was say that as scholars in any kind of field, we have basically there's room in the scholarly world at any one time for 3 or 4 kinds of approaches to a topic in play, because there's limited attention space that scholars have. And what Collins was trying to do was to say that there are some systematic network-based processes and procedures in play that govern the expansion or the contraction of the interest in scholarly programs that goes even beyond, you might say, some objective quality of the ideas themselves. And there's an organizational feature. And I look upon that as an exemplar of the Lesper approach to history of thought, where the Posh approach, which certainly is my approach, once I had to have an approach to get out of this problem I mentioned, is very much exemplified by a paper by Nicholas Vrind, published several years ago, called Was Hayek an Ace? And by ace, what Vrind meant was someone who used agent-based computational modeling. Now, of course, there was no such thing as agent-based computational modeling when Hayek wrote. But what Vrind was saying is basically that someone who is interested in problems of the use of knowledge, of the distribution of knowledge, who has some access to agent-based computational modeling, can find many thoughts and formulations and ideas in Hayek that are worth going back and looking at, because you can now carry them forward and perhaps do something with them that you could not, or Hayek could not have done at the time, because he didn't have access to some of the kinds of techniques and tools for manipulating and thinking about some of the ramifications of those ideas. And so that's the kind of orientation that I bring to this topic. The paper itself is organized around 5 antinomies. One is the Edgeworth versus Marshall, which I've already said I needed to get my place in this program. The second, though, is this distinction between economics conceived really as a science of rational action and economics conceived as a genuine social science. I think those are 2 quite different things, as I will mention as I go along. And the third, then, is whether at the core of what we're thinking about, which comes back to Marshall versus Edgeworth as exemplars, is wants or activities. With respect to Edgeworth and wants, what I have in mind in particular is his long essay on taxation in the 2nd volume of his collected papers. What I have with respect to Marshall and activities is that chapter on wants and the relation to activities and progress and so forth. And so I want to keep that kind of antinomy in play, because I think that ties directly back to the rational action versus social science. And then with respect to the social question, and how might the social question of the potential transformation of latent conflict into concord be approached. And here I draw an opposition, and I always work in oppositions. I draw an opposition between leveling and raising as 2 alternative orientations towards that kind of issue. And finally, I have this focus on quality versus quantity that fits in the same kind of issue. That focus is one because ages ago, we were back in Blacksburg, Jim Buchanan put me on to an old Robert Persing book on Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. He said I would like the book, and he was surely right about that, and I've been carrying it with me in my head as well as in my library ever since. And this paper gave me an opportunity to revisit some of those things as well. So the paper is constructed around these antinomies, but main focus is on the social question, and combined with what you might call what I've called the two-sided character of all theoretical formulations. That on the one hand, theoretical formulations, what they're supposed to do is help us see our material more clearly, more sharply, bring it to better focus. There's also a sense in which theoretical formulations cloud our vision. By focusing our thoughts in one place, we don't see somewhere else. But I think probably all familiar with that joke told a lot of economists about the economist convention, where he's down on his knees, rummaging along the curb, and is asked what he's doing there. He says, "Oh, I'm looking for my car key." The interrogator says, "Oh, you lost it there?" "No, I didn't, but I have light here." And well, I mean, that I think that always brings a chuckle. I think that shows that on one hand, theoretical frameworks illuminate areas where they shouldn't. But at the same time, I think that by capturing our attention on that area where they shine, can also lead us to fail to explore other kinds of areas. That's why I think that's one of the virtues of that old Nietzsche kind of mention about the multiple windows. I think in the world that we exist, there can be different ways of looking at things, and I think and that's what I'm really trying to set out to explore here, is a different kind of window for examining what has for a long time been called this social conflict. And there I want to make the distinction between economics conceptualized as a science of rational action and as a genuine social science, and explain what I mean by the difference. As a science of rational action, this leads pretty, I think, immediately to a kind of a framework where people, on the one hand, step into, the market becomes a kind of an object in which people step into to supply inputs and also to extract outputs, and otherwise are unaffected by what goes on. There's no kinds of questions of relationships, of influences on the process of stepping in and stepping out, upon activities and wants and so forth. So it's one that I think leads naturally to a kind of a reduction to some kind of representative agent. I think comes pretty easily out of that kind of formulation. The other, economics and social sciences, which is the program I want to pursue, which means in turn that I have to see both agents and society both as ontologically real. And so, but not society as a thinking creature, but nonetheless as ontologically real. And which means that the basic kind of thought process I need to have to convey that idea isn't reduction of individuals to society through some averaging process, but as some kind of process of supervention in which interaction amongst people generates new kinds of social formations that in turn feed back and influence the activities of the people being examined. And I mentioned on the slide up here a computational model of a traffic jam as a really good illustration of supervention in the generation of new objects out of interaction. I mean, I could, if I had my computer here, illustrate that, but I think you can use your own minds and see it pretty simply. Suppose you have a simple world where people driving the road follow a simple rule that when they enter the highway, they drive as quickly as they can until they get to a certain, say, 2-car length, some length specified in the computer, to the car in front of them. Then they follow that car. And so what you would have in the limiting case would be this steady flow of cars moving down the road. Then if you look back, you would occasionally see a new car come in, zooming until it gets up close, and then it goes like that. So far, so good. Then for whatever reason, a one of the cars in the front slows down for a moment. Everyone's following the simple rules, then the drivers behind have to slow down, and that for a while perhaps come to a stop even, until they can reassert their rule of driving. Now, if you take a series of photographs of that traffic jam, suppose we have this highway marker, and suppose the start of the traffic jam at one time is at marker 50. And you observe this mass of cars that you define as the jam. And then you look at it a few minutes later, the jam starts now at marker 45, marker 40, and so forth. What you have then is a traffic jam that's going backwards. Yet no car ever goes backwards. All cars are always going forwards. So you couldn't very well describe the traffic jam as a gigantic car going backwards, which I think is the kind of technique of representative agent reductionism. And I think rather you describe the traffic jam as a different object, one that is generated through interaction amongst the cars that constitute that jam, but the relationship of those cars to the jam is one of supervention in that ecological literature rather than reduction that is the traffic jam exists on top of or supervenes on the individual cars. And that kind of notion of supervention is one that also I want to carry forward into this examination of two different ways or trying to articulate the social question that I find present both in Edgeworth and in Marshall. And I think a feature that I have up here is reference to fixed souls versus souls as works in progress. And of course, a common sort of formulation of the economics of rational choice is this notion, probably the clearest representation of that would be the Stigler, Becker, Gustavus kind of notion of fixed characters. I want to work with I've always liked that old classical notion of the soul as a work in progress, and which also is the Persic notion. That's that quality versus quantity kind of discussion that Persic made the center of his work. And so, because what I want to, if you have mind and society bidirectionality, where people generate social formations and configurations through their interactions, but those interactions in turn serve to shape and influence the kinds of mentalities and outlooks and actions we have and actions we take. That's what I mean by genuine social science. And so I need a way of keeping and working with that kind of thought, because one of the topics I want to come at in this version goes back to a different piece that Jim Buchanan published a few years ago in Public Choice titled "Afraid to Be Free." And I want to see if there's a way of linking up those kinds of thoughts he articulated there with a kind of a conceptual framework in which the social configurations that we generate, that emerge out of our interactions, can speak to those kinds of outlooks, orientations, and mentalities. And just to give you, before going on to the next slide, to give you an indication of a small-scale indication of that kind of, what I think is that kind of process of work, and the difference between economics as rational action and economics as social science. Take some of the simple examples of recent technological innovation, cell phones, emails, this kind of thing. Now, the usual way of thinking about cell phones and emails is they're liberating. Once upon a time, you had to sit with a phone tethered to a wall to talk on it. Now you can walk around, I've got one right here, you can walk around, talk on your phone wherever you are. You can even take pictures with it, all this sort of stuff. Email, of course, you're always in touch. that's, that's sort of the liberating influence of, in this case, technologies. And the economics is rational economy would stop there. But is there another kind of storyline, the other direction, the second direction, that goes from technologies to our actions, a meaningful sense in which technologies can grab a hold of us, our creations or generations can grab a hold of us? But some of you are too young in this room, I have to say, to think about the times when you were tethered to the wall with your phone, or you didn't have email. But I can remember those days. Now, once upon a time, you could say, you didn't answer my phone. Well, I wasn't home. Maybe somebody didn't want to talk to. No, I wasn't home. No. So, okay. Or you could say, what do you mean you didn't? Well, checks in the mail. Well, all those things that you could use to sort of hold society at bay in various ways, to give you some distance between yourself and your life and the various kinds of claims of others in society, now under modern technology is gone. There is no excuse that the check's in the mail, you didn't get the message, because you're always connected. And if you then refuse to respond, you're being offensive, or you're being lazy. You're not a chap who's quite with it. And so you're going down in esteem. So I think that's a genuine way in which the social sort of creations or formations we generate can in fact, as objects, interact with us, participate in our lives, perhaps not all for the good, but anyway, whether good or bad, it illustrates what I have in mind by this bidirectional character. Now to Marshall. In this opposition between Marshall and Edgeworth, in the paper I make the distinction between raising and leveling as different kinds of conceptual orientations towards this social question, which again has to do with the boundary between conflict and concord. By leveling, one way, in the paper, the way I distinguish the two is, I only did this, I'll do it too. One way I distinguish the two is with an allusion to like a 10,000 meter race. Suppose in a 10,000 meter race you observe participants finishing 10 minutes apart. Now, Henry Simons in his book on personal income taxation in 1938, I think made the reasonable kind of, I think it's a reasonable claim that says beyond some limit, some degrees of equality just to run low. That was his statement. And so suppose someone were to think that, well, a closer bunch at the finish would be desirable. The question is how to accomplish that. And I think the method of leveling then is one that would say, well, we can accomplish that by putting penalties on those who run fast, giving advantages to those who run slow, taking their running ability as some given. I think what I mean by a program of raising would say that the raising would be a program that would seek to get the slower runners to run faster, run more strongly, something like that. That's sort of the illusion, although I'm not sure that this athletic image is the best one, but it's the one that came to mind as my fingers were going across the keyboard at that particular instant. Now, think about that. Raising, of course, is a difficult thing to accomplish, where leveling is easy to accomplish, just tax and spend. Where raising is not, no one knows how to raise, particularly, but I'll come back to that. But here's this quotation from Marshall on socialism. I think the chief dangers of socialism lie not in its tendency towards a more equal distribution of income, where I see no harm in that, but in the sterilizing influence of those mental activities which have gradually raised the world from barbarism. And that's one of those statements that seems to me to be, certainly reflects my kind of sentiment or orientation there, and I think it points to Marshall as engaged in a program would fit the program of raising rather than leveling. What if you go back to, for instance, the basic Edgeworth formulation in a framework, in a model in which there is zero substitution between labor and leisure. Then in the Edgeworth optimal tax formulation, then you would end up with a wholly equal distribution of income that would come out of that formulation based on diminishing market utility of income, which runs the theory through the consumption or the want side of things. I think the Marshallian formulation would say, well, something's amiss there. And what's amiss is the kind of active participation in one's own life that in turn has brought about, in his case, the elevation movement away from barbarism. And I think it's a theory that's focused on activity, the educative features of activity somehow is what I see in Marshall. And in the Edgeworth formulation, utility is separable from income and consumption. And so, consumption and effort. So consumption is valued positively, income or effort is valued negatively. And so the best of all possible worlds is to gorge on consumption and do nothing. That is the exemplar of a good life is Paris Hilton. And somehow, as an implication of the theoretical framework, that doesn't, maybe it's my Puritan upbringing, I'm not sure. But as an example of where a theoretical framework brings you to, I find myself uneasy with that formulation. Plus, it's inconsistent with the ongoing character of social life anyway. Because if you think about how the theory of consumption is portrayed in basic micro-theory, we speak of consumers having an endowment facing given prices and distributing spending their endowment among those goods given their prices and their utilities. And you ask, where's that endowment come from? Well, it's plausible as an individual. You go back to Don Patinkin and those money, interest, and prices. He makes a distinction between individual experiments and market experiments. Individual experiments you can sensibly perform in an individual, but you can't sensibly perform in a market. And that you can sensibly face a person with an endowment and ask what that person will do, because you take an endowment from somewhere else in the society. But for a society, there is no endowment. The endowment is something that's generated through the interactions amongst the participants. And so I think a consistent kind of social theory would have to give an account of the creation and the generation of the material that we're theorizing about. And so I think you can't really have a theory based on endowments. Societies have endowments, because I think there's always otherwise that reversion towards zero. And so that leads me to look elsewhere. And I think the Marshallian formulation then is one that my sense is that it wouldn't be this separation between utility, between effort and consumption, but rather somehow, I think the Marshallian framework, what I see there anyway, is that effort is part of the process in which we participate in ongoing life as societies, and we generate patterns of living, raise ourselves from, graduate from barbarism, and so forth. And how to give an account of that kind of conceptual framework is what I'm concerned with going forward. And it leads to as I kind of formulated it, I think there's this question of whether you conceptualize life as a matter of facing a recurring, continuing set of challenges that we deal with, or whether it's conceptualized as a continual parade of feast. Now, the problem with a continual parade of feast is you can't have a parade of feast without people providing the feasts, which gets us back to the endowment kind of question. So, in terms of a theoretical framework centered on human activity, I think the tension, as I see, turn towards the interesting activities, where they come from, and where they go. And so, I'm thinking about the social question. I can see one more of those forks in the road. One fork in the road that I think is a fork that is pretty much compelled by the construction of economics of the science of rational conduct, is one that then is led to a focus on consumption and of redistribution and of leveling. Now, I think that one chief advantage of a program of leveling is everyone knows how to do it. It's an easy thing. You just tax some people and you give the money to someone else. That's all it takes to level. Raising is something altogether different, because raising requires the cooperation of whoever it is that's being raised. Most of us as university faculty face this problem all the time. We want to raise students. Well, how do you raise students? Well, if you try harder, one possibility is that your effort will simply substitute into their leisure. And so you work harder, do better, and they have more leisure. So now they go to more sporting events, parties, whatever it is, and you're exhausted because you've put so much effort into instructing them. And so we have that kind of situation where the success of a program of raising is an interactive kind of process. It's not a unidirectional process. Leveling is a unidirectional process. Raising is not. What you're dealing with is a whole vector of qualities, as it were, and not some scalar magnitude of amounts. And what I mean by the combinatorics of fatherless boys and so forth down there under civil society and polycentricity then is, not the right slide, that's not the slide. What I mean by that then is by raising being complex, I mean, take fatherless boys. You look in terms of, going back to the literature of the social question, or to the Richmond. Take one small piece of that, fatherless boys. Now, one of the main problems any society faces is civilizing young men. Most of us there at one time or another, we had to be civilized. Or maybe we still have to be civilized, but the civilizing of young boys and young men is a perennial problem that all societies face and deal with in varying degrees. And there's plenty of evidence out there that fatherless boys are more difficult to civilize, more persistent sources of scourges on society, and so on and so forth. So how might fatherless boys be dealt with? Well, you might say, well, one is to put them in foster homes. Another is then say foster homes. Do you put them in foster homes? Foster homes. So what does it describe a tree or a branch? Branching of a tree. So which, if if you look at the whole tree, the social question, because now I'm not talking about some simply scalar magnitude of the amount of transfer, but I'm talking about a whole vector of characteristics and activities that altogether would constitute some effort to address this social question. And so I want to put that into a combinatorial frame of reference that has this characteristic then of a multiple branch tree. And so if we go from the social question, one branch of that would be this question of fatherless boys and how to treat fatherless boys in this kind of case. Many other branches as well. But fatherless boys is one branch. Then if you trace that out, I think what I come with is a structure of further branches. You have, okay, well, fatherless boys, put them into foster care. Then if you take the foster care branch, then I think you could think up in terms of people on the ground doing actual things. You can have, well, does it matter if the foster care site is one where the other children present are males or females? Because if, one might say if fatherless boys are a problem, you wouldn't want females perhaps being raped. So that's that kind of branch. And you could think of multiple branches. Rather than foster care, maybe in the institutionalized care. Institutionalized care, a further branch in terms of whether it be secular, religious, and so forth. And so there's multiple kinds of branches just for there. And you can think through the whole set of features. Because if you say economics and social science, the question becomes, one then going back to the variability of the soul. If economics and social science, the question of the social question is how, as far as this interest in concord, the question is how can people come to acquire a feeling, a positively oriented feeling of engagement in the life of society? And how does that get established or suffocated and so forth? And so I think that has this complex combinatorial kind of structure to it. So then on top of that, then in terms of, we get into matters of Samaritan's dilemmas. Because if you go down that complex combinatorics mode, Rob, and how do you think of treat with that? And in terms of, say, monocentric versus polycentric approaches to dealing with that. That if you have a monocentric approach, what you have is the equivalent of a lender of last resort. If someone can't do well, then there is always going to be someone who's going to provide support. But you have what Jim articulated as Faraday's dilemma, once upon a time in collective action setting. Whereas if you have polycentric kinds of civil society forms of support, there is no one person or one agency that's responsible for saying no to the person. Because you can always go elsewhere. Everyone may say no, but there is no person who in any kind of knowing way is the person who rejects you. And I think that kind of organization, perhaps, at least my kind of sense of it, is more conducive to generating a pattern of activities and conduct that would deal more effectively, perhaps, with this social question than the other, than the more monocentric approach. Now, my last section is what I call a Marshallianite peroration on quantity, quality, and flourishing. That's, again, goes back to Robert Percy. The first part of this slide now just summarizes what I've already said in terms of leveling being a simple program, raising being a complex program, and how do you deal with inherent simplicity versus complexity in a social organizational kind of way, where I think that principles of computation, of competition, experimentation, and so forth are, I think, more likely to generate useful approaches than some kind of monocentric point. Now, I'm not actually sure how I got Adam Smith in here, actually, but that's one of the things where I find that typing sometimes takes on a life of its own. But I know what it was because equality and Persig I linked together. And so I began to think about Adam Smith and the pin factory. And thinking, well, would I really want to work in a pin factory where all my life isn't just, I'm not making a pin now, remember. I'm maybe straightening it, I'm cutting it. That's all I do all day long. And I'm thinking, because if we're running life, we want to run the organization, social organization, through human activity and its patterns and the effect of our activities on ourselves and our orientation to the life around us is somehow what I'm looking for a way to think about. And so if I do that, I find myself, well, sure, I can see the pin factory, division of labor, economies of scale, and all that sort of thing. And I'm not going to deny that. What I'd say then is there's going to be some kind of limit on the extent to which those kinds of activities are undertaken in the society. That's going to be limited by the willingness of people to take on boredom in exchange for wages of a higher amount through compensating differentials. So there will be that. There will be a certain kind of amount of effort organized in ways that don't engage much of the range of human families. Now in this, I've become very intrigued. I have this reference by a fellow named Robert Crawford, who apparently lives here in Richmond. He had this wonderful book I came across called Shopcraft and Soulcraft. And I was really intrigued because I once wrote a paper on soulcraft that was published in Jibo a few years ago. And so what's interesting about Crawford work on soulcraft, the theme of that work is trying to say that our ordinary dichotomies between blue-collar and white-collar work are really misused or misrepresented because there's an awful lot of white-collar work that is equivalent to a pin factory. And there's an awful lot of blue-collar work that is very much engages the physical and mental activities of the people who participate in it. And this Crawford, for instance, got his PhD from the Committee on Social Thought and Political Philosophy. And directed a think tank in DC for a while. And just got tired of it. And he's running a motorcycle repair shop here in Richmond. And he also has an affiliation with a group in Charlottesville, a university, some sort of culture, study of culture, whatever group. And I find myself very intrigued by that as well. And so it's that, in a way, it's a treatment of a kind of an alienation that I guess I'm wrestling with here. And that, so you make the distinction between the patterns of activities are, say, now we have, say, a model of a factory assembly line model and a craft kind of model in terms of trying to give an account for the structure of activity that goes on in society, and ask where that boundary appears in a society between that framework. That's what these final two slides look about. The paper only has one slide, but as I was thinking more about it after I sent it off, I realized that the figure I put in the paper didn't really convey fully what I wanted to convey, and so I added a second one. So I'm going to project two, well, not instantly, of course, but I will project two. The first one, I changed the label to, now it's, I don't know what it's called. I don't want to clear it up yet. Oh yeah, there we go. The first one, I'll put it in, I call dyadic versus triadic exchange, statics. The next one I call emergent dynamics, and it's that statics versus emergent dynamics. I want to focus on the first one. I put up this comparative statics slide. Okay. What is this meant to illustrate? Look on the left-hand side. That illustrates what I think we mean by ordinary market exchange relationships. The two big circles represent, say, two enterprises that have a commercial transaction that's illustrated by the arrows that connect them. Ordinary exchange model. The little arrows at the top and bottom of those big circles, along with small circles below, that's meant to indicate the idea of gains from trade. And so through the relationship, there is a gain that each party extracts. So that on the left is meant to be a simple kind of presentation of an ordinary market relationship. That cloud in the middle of the triangle between those arrows is meant, well, the cloud, my original thinking, well, first of all, it comes out of PowerPoint. It's one of those things that's just there. Somebody picked it out. But it's meant to indicate that, well, maybe this is a bit of an ideological dream. But maybe not. I mean, in the sense that it's meant to convey the idea that a triangle represents state. And state exists between the boundaries of the transaction. What I mean by that, then, is state doesn't participate in the economic nexus, but simply acts as a referee. The state actions are confined by the agreements of the participants as shown by these solid lines over there. And so that's what I would call a perfectly adhering rule of law state. What I say by a millennial dream is perhaps an overstatement, but I was thinking of John Hughes, way back in the 70s, had this book out on, well, anyway, it was something about economic regulation. The government will have it. The government will have it. It was about economic regulation back in colonial times going forward. And so there was always some governmental regulation, interference, and so forth in commercial life. But still, there's a much smaller scale. And so this, anyway, is dyadic exchange is meant to be a representation of how we theorize about commercial life in the framework of a purely market-organized society. This vision on the right of triadic exchange, and is a transformation of the left-hand side, where the state does two things. One, the state moves out. The state over here is no longer confined by the agreements of the participants. It's no longer, in Jim's terms, a protective state fulfilling that role of maintaining agreements previously made, but rather becomes an active participant. And so we now have basically a three-body problem rather than a two-body problem, put it in that fashion. Now, what you see further is, if you look at the arrows that go from the circles to the triangle. One arrow runs from the circle of market-based firm to the triangle or the state. The other arrow runs from the state to the market-based firm. That's meant to illustrate the idea that in this alternative participating kind of mode of collective activity, that the state is participating, influencing the pattern of activities within the society, and favoring one side here and disfavoring the other side. But then that's the figure I submitted for the paper. And then I was looking at it. So, you know, that doesn't really quite tell the story the way I want to tell it. Because this is kind of a comparative static kind of story. You have this kind of model of the economy over there, the a two-sided exchange, and then you have this kind of model here, the three-sided exchange with a pattern of favoritism and not. And with that pattern of favoritism within a public choice framework would be an important part of how that came to be. But the story I want to tell, though, is that within the emergent dynamic context, this transformation is going to lead to changes in the pattern of activities. That's the kind of thing I'm trying to get at. And so that led to this next diagram, where what's going to happen is this triadic exchange is simply going to move over there, and I'm going to put something else up here. So as you see, it will be clearer. There we go. So now I've changed this to earlier time and later time, because what I want to work with is a type of theorizing that is done more in terms of an ecological motif of continual development and change as being one of the ongoing features of social processes. And so what this later time then shows is and I could also do this movie, but in this way, what this shows is at the bottom here, the enterprise here that's being disfavored, its returns on its trade is shrinking. Its size is shrinking. This size here is less than that size there. So the enterprise is shrinking. Its net returns is shrinking. If you look at the profits accumulated by the state, it's growing. I probably should have made that triangle bigger. That's going to fit what I wanted, but that's didn't do it that way. And also the enterprise up there is bigger, growing. And so if you think about these not in terms of statics, but in terms of dynamics, what you see is a shrinkage of one phase of these relationships, an expansion in the other phase of those relationships, an expansion in the size of the state as well, which I think, in terms of what we know about public choice process and so forth, would also, I think, reasonably well translate into a favoritism of large enterprises over smaller enterprises, an increase in what you might call the large-scale corporatization of society. Much thinking, I think, takes the sizes of enterprises as just kind of a natural phenomenon, a natural outcome of market-based processes. But if those outcomes are also importantly influenced by the kinds of social processes, governmental processes, and so forth in place, then there isn't some kind of natural distribution of size of enterprises that's independent of social institutions, but rather is shaped by those social institutions. And so this leads, I can see the way I'm trying to think of here, it would say then, it gets back to something else that Jim was talking about earlier about banks this morning, is that they're, with this kind of triadic exchange framework, then the size of banking institutions and other institutions is in part generated not through some kind of pure market process, but it's generated through this alternative kind of process. Means, going back to that Crawford and Adam Smith, it means that then there's an increase in the amount of pin factory kinds of activity, a decrease in the amount of shop craft kinds of activity that isn't reflected wholly in terms of a pure model of equalizing differences, but is run through this kind of political economy kind of framework. And so, if, in closing, and in a more normative vein, I'm thinking about this shopcraft factory boundary. You think of what makes for a good society or a good set of social arrangements. And I think the approach through leveling, the approach that I get from that tax essay of Edgeworth is that in terms of that maximization of aggregate utility kind of framework that runs through consumption. But then if you have zero elasticity of substitution between effort and consumption, then the best society would be one that had equal distribution of income in that formulation. A socialist society or a communist society. And you wonder, well, in that kind of society, what are you responsible for? What do you do? You ever think about it? When you meet people, do you ask them, what do you consume? No. You ask them, what do you do? Plus, what we like to do is to a great extent governed and influenced by what we do. And so it's that what we do question that I think should be at the forefront of economic thinking, because it's at the forefront of normal human behavior. It's what we typically ask strangers when we meet them is what they do. What do they do? Now, so that would suggest that they form a social organization. One way of thinking about it wouldn't be so much in terms of equalization of consumption, but in terms of the generation of possibilities for interesting lives, where in which people, you know, what can we create in our life, if not our biographies? And to create a biography, you have to be able to assign yourself to the task. Under socialism, you can't assign it. Only one assigner. Someone assigns you, but you don't assign yourself. And so it's that kind of question of what kinds of social arrangements lead to more interesting kinds of adventures in life, or something like that. Maybe that's not the exact way to pose the question. But that's certainly what I'm trying to wrestle with in this kind of social kind of question. And I realize it's very open-ended, not easy to grab a hold of. I happen, unfortunately, in some respects, to be attracted to things that are hard to grab a hold of. But I think this kind of focus on the organization of activities, the things we do, it gets back again to questions of what kinds of things are we responsible for. This question about afraid to be free. It goes back. Tocqueville had it, and also Vincent Ostrom in his book on the meaning of democracy or something like that. He had this formulation of what he referred to Tocqueville as the sickness of the people, which is a kind of a lack of will, perhaps, to wrestle and deal with difficult challenges. And if those qualities, get back to quality again rather than quantity, if those qualities are things that social processes can reinforce or extinguish to some extent, then I think I would submit that there is a further set of issues to think about. And in this context, since I have become increasingly interested in sociological kinds of matters that are relation to economics, I might also note, Marshall here, that Talcott Parsons, who moved from economics to sociology at Harvard, once wrote a book on what he regarded as a great economist, or excuse me, great sociologist. And the main figures there were Karl Marx, Alfred Marshall, Joseph Schumpeter, and Goffredo Pareto. I just came out with a book called Mind and Society that was the same kind of thing. And I think it's that kind of issue that I find really animates me, and I find there's a lot of figures in the history of economics and sociological theory that have the same kind of sense, and it gets back to Posh again in closing, that I do like to read old books, because I find that often those characters were thinking about things in really kind of interesting and fascinating kinds of ways, and this is something that, Marshall's not the only person living to think in this way, but it was certainly on reflecting on Marshall in that whole kind of way in which he thought about progress and the place of activities as being central to human life that led me in that direction. I thank you anyway for your attention.
That's fine.
Jonathan White, from the University of Richmond. Really enjoyed your paper. I didn't see anything in your paper about a march of Sen, and I wondered, particularly given your conclusion, whether that might be a fruitful. I think he's trying to get at the, the measure of progress and so on in a way that would be very sympathetic to what you're trying to get at. And also a comment. I wonder if there's a danger of formalizing it the way you are, where you're emphasizing the effort, so emphasizing the consumption, that you'll be falling into a little bit of a trap that somebody in 30 years will be at this session saying, see, we've glorified the egoism of production now, and we have to become all Buddhists, where we simply are, we don't consume, we don't produce, we simply are. And I'm wondering if you've thought down that road at all.
No, I have, and first on Sen, in terms of things like capabilities and these things, I think are very important. I think there's very much of a kindred spirit at work there, and this is something that has a long way to go. It's very much a work in progress that I intend to pursue for quite some time, and so Sen in that respect, quite right. In terms of emphasizing effort, that may not be the right way to do it. See, some of these things, when you start thinking about things, I think there is a kind of a path, a penance perhaps, in terms of your own way that you approach things that may be influenced by how you got there. And I got there through reflecting on, in part on this standard formulation of utility functions as being separable in effort and consumption, and thinking that what that implied, and that's where I came up with that little line about Paris Hilton and so forth. But contrasting that with a article that was published in Kikos a few years ago called "Why Do People Climb Mountains?" by Lowenberg, I think it was, one of the behavioral guys. And I think a standard separable utility formulation would say, well, climbing a mountain is the effort, then you come back and you have a snifter of cognac in the evening. That's the reward, that's the consumption. And so you climb the mountain to get the cognac. That's the kind of sort of theory of life, that the separable utility function. No, I think my way of thinking, and I mention this to students, is that you have both text and subtext always. And there is a text that speaks to the explicit recognition that you articulate. But there's also a subtext that's always there that informs the tacit kinds of understanding of what you're dealing with. And I think in this case, the climbing the mountains, drinking the cognac, I want a way that makes that life becomes a meaningful whole, not so much separated and cut and sliced and diced into these things, but somehow I have this kind of sense that the kind of separable utility function has a subtext that kind of de-emphasizes some very important parts of social life in society that becomes impoverished, that somehow I think needs to be beefed up. And that climbing the mountains had that kind of, it fit in with the idea of we want life to be meaningful. What I refer to as interest and intervention, another word for that would be meaningfulness and so forth. And in the social context means that meaningfulness, I think, has to be found in the recognition of value that other people appreciate and recognize, which again brings in sort of context. And it's all that, and I have this kind of feeling that economic theory has too much lost sight of society as a legitimate object of theorizing. So that's all what I'm trying to wrestle with.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up?
Sure.
I'm really glad you brought in those elements, because it sounds like where you're heading towards is something maybe like virtue ethics, that you can't separate it all out, and you've got to questions and you've got to explore.
Well, you know, Alistair McIntyre had a wonderful book out called After Virtue, as a matter of fact. And he too, you know, he pursued this dichotomy of quality and quantity. That was a theme that ran throughout that book. And so you can blame Jim Buchanan on that, because he put me on that Persic book to start with. So, but yeah, I think you're right.
As a follow-up of Sam's approach, is thinking about rating, is it not there? So what do you think about how they can be integrated in your account?
I don't know how they can necessarily be integrated. Down the road, I would hope to have something more fully thought out about that. You know, obviously, in terms of human organisms as able to operate, that you know, these questions, whether you talk about healthcare, famine, and so forth, are very much on the table. There's still a question of whether that's approached through a mode of raising or a mode of leveling.
It's about raising.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there is, I think, still that kind of distinction. But yeah, that would certainly be in it.
Michael Mikowski, Towson University. I'm gonna actually use some of the work of yours that I've read before in fiscal sociology, and I think a little bit about the drawings you how there's a state agent, and then there were these regular producing, consuming agents, whatever you want to think of them as. And you've spoken previously of conceiving as all these agents as being quite similar, but rather defined by the set of rules that they're operating under. So you have those that are operating within a state system with state rules, state incentives, state mechanisms for rewarding behavior and production. In terms of what they also trade in the currency, trade in political affairs. And then agents operating in a traditional marketplace, operating with traditional rules. And thinking about what we discussed earlier with the market for rules and how they matter and how they emerge. And I wonder a little bit if what we run into here is the temptation to try to endogenize everything. That very quickly we can have all these agents and the rules are emergent and their relationships are defined by the set rules governing their relationships, and then some are under market-based rules. And I wonder how and this is a very open-ended and difficult question, how we decide when to stop endogenizing, when does the model sufficient to answer whatever question we're going after? Are we emerging rules, or are we putting them in exogenously? Are we defining agent types by rules, or are we assigning them exogenously, and so on?
Well, Mike, you always ask difficult questions, even back in your classroom days, for sure. I guess one answer to that is how much you endogenize depends on what you want to do, what you can get useful information and formulations out of. I know any kind of theoretical framework is going to have some things that are simply taken as given. You have to have some various given starting points. Now, in many words, given starting point can, in a different system of thought, be thought of as being endogenous, but even that framework is always going to have some fixed starting points. I think so I don't think there's like a clear answer to when you can stop. It's like, go back to the injunction, you shouldn't eat too deeply of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, right? Well, but we can't help ourselves either. I mean, that's a feature of life too. Remember, it reminds me, maybe excuse for a minute, on Father's Day, I had an email this morning from one of my two daughters. I got a card from the other one yesterday, but from one of my two daughters. She's in her 40s now. But this was the one who, back when she was about 3 or 4 years of age or so, remember I had a Bible I was reading to her in the evenings, illustrated Bible stories and so forth, creation and all this. Smart kid. So all of a sudden she said, "And Dad, who created God?" Giggled. She was so proud of herself. So I said, "Stephanie, time to go to bed." And so, and we all have, we pose problems to ourselves. That's the nature of what we're doing, and try to pursue it. And I don't know. This is part of my interesting adventures in life, and trying to make some sense out of some of these kinds of issues. And I happen to be attracted to perplexing things. I can recognize that, every system of thought is going to have some things, a platform from which you start, but you don't question. That's just pure and simple. And you want to find forms that at least allow you to go somewhere. That's all I can say for my defense.
Hi. I've been working in binary sort of opposites, but it seems it seems very, very harsh in a sense. And two comments on that. One, you talked about Paris Hilton actually in a slightly sort of derogatory fashion as this consuming agent, but I mean, doesn't she produce this incredible product, which is herself, through her consuming activities? So, I mean, isn't that, can we, because it seems like you've drawn this contrast between the consumer and the producer. Consumption is bad, and producing is good. What do you do? What do you use? But isn't that sort of making an analogy, if you like, making that homologous with consumption, with leveling and raising? I don't know, I'm not convinced. And the second thing is, I mean, are you really saying that the state can do nothing? I think this is a point that Marcel actually also raised, but can you really say that the state can do nothing to raise people? I mean, does tax and spend always about consumption, about using up resources with no worth?
First, on your second question, theory of optimal taxation, which stems out of from Edgeworth's formulation, that was all about leveling, taxing at the high end and transferring to the bottom. And so that was a specific context there. As far as consumption, no, I'm certainly not opposed to consumption, and that's where I like that Lowenstein piece on climbing mountains in terms of meaning and so forth. And there's one of your countrywomen, Mary Hollis, who wrote a wonderful book on the world of goods that also sought to locate consumption within a kind of a social setting of meaning and so forth. And so that's all part of what I do. As far as Paris Hilton, I'm probably betraying a certain kind of Victorian-like strand there, which Marshall had, I guess. And also I have references in my paper to Gertrude Himmelfarb, who's also I'm a big fan of her. And she's done marvelous work on the Victorians and related kinds of questions. So I'm probably, to some extent, betraying certain, I think, I try to keep this pretty much at the positive kind of vein. We all have our kind of underlying kinds of predilections and so forth, and I'm probably showing some of my basic kind of, what you might call actually Calvinistic kind of sobriety coming through.
Actually, I've got some follow-ups on the issues that Chris raised. And first of all, on this distinction between leveling and raising, it brings to mind that there's all sorts of, there's some underlying metaphors it raises, and it sort of bears to admit this, but the way I dealt with traffic coming down here is I listened to this book on tape by George Lakoff, Whose Freedom? I don't know if people are familiar with this, but he makes the distinction, and you could do it, that you implicitly have between raising and leveling, and he talks about, quote, dynamic progressives and radical conservatives, and he has the exact opposite twist on what's involved in sort of leveling and raising. And the dynamic progressives, the idea is you redistribute, and then that's going to have all these positive things for children and some of the educational things, and then the the radical conservatives, they have to always be radical, but they just want to protect their property, sort of seize it and so on. But his thing is, he's a linguist, and it's all about the underlying metaphors, and so it raises this issue of thinking more carefully about the metaphors involved and how one can do it either direction. I guess it reminds me, I recall the old distinction between static and dynamic, the way it's defined. Many of you may know that, which is that basically, this is what Fogel told us in economic history, which is that basically, my model, the way it goes is, your model is a static model, my model is a dynamic model. And it's sort of the same issue of putting it that way. So you can and then on your issue about government, or the issue that came up, and I thought you were maybe getting at this at the end. First of all, there's this Mansur-Olson notion of growth promoting government and how that fits. And I thought maybe you were getting at some of that with your last slide, I don't know. But the other thing that comes to mind that recently, in talking about, John Wallace and Douglas North have been interested in opening up the notion of the state and distinguishing between the state and the government. There's a paper that John gave us where that was the whole notion that you want to, as the way you're opening up the notion of the consumer and the psychology, there's the issue of getting more fully into what's involved in the state, and there's a distinction between the state and the government, which can open up some further things too. So.
I'm very much prone to thinking about states not as acting entities, but simply as arenas of participation that have many different participants. In fact, I've been working this notion of what I've called kind of an enterprise-based public finance, which says that a state has many different enterprises, that you don't expect coherence from a state, you don't get it. What you get is there's as much competition and clashing within the programs that constitute a state as there is within the programs that constitute a market. We have within the market, we have people producing cigarettes and people producing stuff to dissuade you from smoking. Within the state, we have people producing security services and people producing services that keep you from being secure, such as schools that don't teach people how to have useful kinds of lives and so forth. At least that's my take on it. And so that states lack any kind of coherence to attribute to a person. If you were to attribute a state, treat a state as a person, you'd say it has a mass of intersecting difference curves, despite the market. But they're both, I think, orders and not organizations. And so that's how I've been thinking about it, which I think is in the similar vein as that, yes. I think I missed one of your questions. I forget what it was now.
First part about this leveling,
oh,
is that
no.
static or dynamic? This issue of leveling, static or dynamic, I guess.
I'm not at all sold on the reference to raising. But leveling has a long-term political programs and so forth that fits nicely with the optimal tax kind of notion. I wanted something that contrasted with that optimal tax notion. And then I got caught up in this 10,000 meter image because I was also thinking about Henry Simons in that income tax book had this thing, well, he just thought that too much inequality wasn't lovely. And thought, well, that's a reasonable position to entertain. And then the question is, the Marshallian quote, is the way to reduce inequality basically one that, in that 10,000 meter illustration, is one that puts shackles, as it were, on people who run fast. Or gives head starts to those who run slow. Or is it one that somehow gets those who run slower to run faster? Now, when we talk about running, we're talking about natural abilities, but we're talking about existence in market-based societies. Then what does it take to get along in market-based societies? Well, for instance, perhaps some people, where do people learn good manners, politeness, courtesy, and so forth? They usually learn it in well-ordered homes with parents present and so forth. And so people who show up late or discourteous and so forth, if those talents, or the lack of those talents, is part of the depressing effect on their possibilities, then how do they acquire those talents? And somehow it's the acquisition of those kinds of, what's the talents and outlooks that are for life in modern societies, and how do they get there? I mean, the common economic presumption is that they're innate, they're simply there. And everyone has a well-ordered utility function. And that's what I want to work with, is that these are things that to some extent are learned, and most people are learned in homes in the early years. Some people, they're not. And if then the observed distribution is a matter of these talents and orientations, or better or less or more, then what I mean by raising is that kind of promotion of those kinds of talents and orientations. Now, I agree, and someone else said this thing too, that raising has a kind of a classy kind of connotation to it. Doesn't, I mean, I sense that even when I was writing it, and I have it in my head up here somewhere. See if I can think of an alternative term, but that's the idea I want to work with. Yeah.
Daniela, when you started answering him, you gave a very broad definition of state. What do you mean by state? And I was a little bit confused, because if I see the United States, you have a federal state, national state, and all these organizations are in some way intertwined or separated. But every state has also municipalities, and the organization of everything is intertwined. But you have also cooperation, cooperative, but you have community college that are something special. But you have also a state university that are connected to the state. So that I cannot understand what do you mean by civil society. If you give such a definition of state, I don't understand what is a civil society. I referred to the United States because I know in Europe it's another story. It's different. I made the reference to here because maybe it's to this system you were referring to. Thank you.
Well, you know, on that I was very much influenced a number of years ago by a paper actually published by Maffeo Pantaleone in 1911.
Yes.
And he had this two bazaar model. And so you had the market bazaar, and then you had the political bazaar, and market prices and political prices. And that sort of set in motion my thinking in terms of market and state both being terms that represent different kinds of places where people interact and transact under different kinds of rules and principles, which then led me increasingly to think then of both of them as being kind of open access kinds of commons, in the sense that people are able to choose how much to participate, to what extent, and then how do you think your way through that kind of system. And that's, I've been stuck on that kind of topic ever since, but that's, so I think about state and market both as general purpose names or categories, that if we think in terms of society, look at society, all we have are people doing things. And they do things through these different kinds of arenas that we can, on one hand, say, well, this is a political or state arena, but another is a market arena. And that's the kind of architecture in my head when I think about these things.
Thank you.
I think we should draw us to a close, David. Why don't we take a 15-minute break? Thank Dick for his good talk.